Yeah.
Yep.
Good.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is the webinar series for the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Work Group of the National Water Quality Monitoring Council. In a moment, I'll be putting some links in the chat for you to check out if you would like to learn more about the council, the JEDI work group, and how to access the webinar recordings. My name is Sylvia Lee. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and co-chair of the JEDI work group. Today, I want to especially acknowledge a happy Native American Heritage Month, also known as the American Indian and Alaska Native Heritage Month. Not too long ago, I learned that there are 229 federally recognized tribes in Alaska. That's a lot. So I thought while the chat in the Zoom here is it's a bit limited for sharing meaningful Indigenous land acknowledgements, it does provide a way for us to connect with each other in this space. So in celebration of Native American Heritage Month and today's webinar topic, I would love for everyone to use the chat to share with us your location. And if you're able to, one or more of the Indigenous groups associated with your location in the chat as well. Next slide, please. The National Water Quality Monitoring Council is committed to promoting justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within all aspects of water quality monitoring and assessment. Our success in achieving water quality goals depends on learning from people of all backgrounds. We are committed to fostering an inclusive and respectful culture for all participants and actively improving JEDI throughout council activities by working aggressively to remove systemic and institutional barriers that add layers of disadvantage and environmental injustice to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ+ communities, persons with disabilities, and other minoritized groups. We acknowledge that our initiatives are a work in progress and commit to training and educating our members on implicit biases and historical environmental injustices so that we may continuously improve how we amplify underrepresented voices and support opportunities for the broader water quality monitoring community. Thank you everyone for joining us, and let me hand it over to Barb Horn.
Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome. Thanks, Sylvia. I'm Barb Horn. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I have the privilege of living in the southwest corner of Colorado in the United States that are still, I actually live on the land stewarded still today by the Southern Ute tribes, very close to the Ute Mountain Ute tribes. And there's a sister Ute nation in Utah. So this is a really big topic. So welcome everybody. And we intend for this webinar to sort of wet the whistle, if you will, and have some series of follow-up webinars to the best of our ability to put them on that will go into more details on some of these important concepts we'll present today. So welcome, and please put your questions in the QA part of the, I believe we're gonna go through all the content and then answer your questions. So we won't lose track of them. And if for some reason we don't answer your questions, this is recorded. We will make sure we get to you individually to answer your questions to the best of our ability. There's that QA button at the bottom. If you do have any technical issues, if you could put them in the chat if you're able to, or let us know in your own way. We'd be happy to try to deal with those as well. So let's see, this big topic is addressing and beginning to explore the cultural and traditional water uses and their nexus or their ability to integrate or not with the Clean Water Act in the United States. Next slide, please. And thanks everybody for putting your land acknowledgements in the chat. It's great to see the diverse range, we're covering the original North Americans of the United States, at least in this one. So again, my name is Barb Horn. I'm sort of setting the stage. Our primary presenter will be Brian or Ibrahim Goodwin, and he'll introduce himself, and that'll be followed by Nick from California and some strategies that they're using to integrate Native American uses into the Clean Water Act from the California Water Quality Monitoring Council. We'll also touch a little bit on the back end of this Clean Water Act processes when data and information is already available, and introduce CARE data principles. And we will end the conversation with announcing EPA's additions to How's My Watershed application and its relationship to this. So that's the big schedule. Again, keep track of your questions, and we'll answer them as we go along here. Thanks, Nick, for running the tech slides behind here and hosting all of this. Next slide, please. So our overall high-reaching objectives for today's webinar is to just, we don't know the level of knowledge out there on the concept of Clean Water Act designated uses, so there's going to be a little 101 on that. But begin to be aware of the tribal sovereignty, and that's the relationship to tribes and First Nations' right to rule over their lands and their waters, and how that just varies so vastly with the size of the actual tribal nation, the diversity of resources, the land, it just varies over the United States. So just beginning to look at the awareness of that. And then diving a teeny bit deeper this time, but future webinars will cover more to explore this nexus of tribal uses and the tools we have, like the Clean Water Act, to protect those. What are some of the successes that are out there? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the barriers? And then to begin to identify some opportunities, again, of which we can go into deeper in future webinars. Next slide, please. So most of you are aware that the Clean Water Act, celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, we should be happy for that, is the primary goal is to make waters of the nation fishable and swimmable. And for sovereign nations, they get to their ability of resources and capacity, create their own Clean Water Act systems and have that support from the United States EPA. So relative to this, whether you're familiar or not, we wanted to highlight some elements of the Clean Water Act. This might be a little repetitive, but that's okay because, again, the knowledge based across the audience is vast and varies. Is that the Clean Water Act uses elements in its overall workflow and system to protect our waters. One of those is assigning and identifying designated uses, which a particular state or tribe could adopt. Once those uses are adopted, like drinking water, which is a common universal use, then that use is protected by criteria that's scientifically credible. That criteria could be a narrative, which is a statement describing a condition, like waters need to be free from fill in the blank. Or it also could be numeric, that there's literally a numeric threshold that would protect that use. What the system that is uses that are adopted, protected by criteria, is to assess basically with data, exposure, the duration and frequency and magnitude that an organism, whether that's a plant, animal, or human, would be exposed to a particular threshold and thus potentially be harmed. So once these uses are adopted and there's the criteria to define them, they are assigned to various water bodies, whether that's a river, a lake, an estuary, or even a wetland or some surface water body. We're basically focusing on surface water with the Clean Water Act here. Then there's funding or the need to have a monitoring program to collect data. And that then goes through some sort of assessment protocol to determine if a use is met or isn't met. And based on those conclusions, Basically, resources and directions are allocated to protect that water body in the same way it has been, so that use remains protected, or if it was impaired or degraded in some way, pathways and resources to restore it. This is a high-level overview for those of you that may not be as familiar with the Clean Water Act as some of you. Next slide, please. So typical Clean Water Act designated uses across the United States that states adopt are on the left here. These are just examples of the classic water designated uses across the United States: domestic supply, drinking water, recreation, aquatic life, agriculture, which includes protection for animals like cows and horses, but also for crops that are grown, that are eaten by people and animals. That should be shellfish propagation. I don't know what a shellfish looks like, but maybe you do. Or fish consumption. These are, again, examples that are protected. And this traditional, typical designated use doesn't very easily integrate other types of uses, like traditional environmental ecological knowledge, observational data, local knowledge, anecdotal knowledge, aren't easily integrated and protected with the system that's in place. It's been effective. We're celebrating its 50th anniversary, but it's very capitalistic centered, and it has a limited ability to integrate, again, traditional ecological or environmental knowledge, which some of you might recognize the acronym TEK, that encapsulates the traditional ecological environmental knowledge. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to turn it over to my compatriot, Ibrahim, from EPA. He can introduce himself, and he's going to take us through an analysis that he conducted around what exists out there currently in the Clean Water Act around cultural water use on tribal lands. Thank you, Ibrahim, and take it away.
Thank you, Barb. This is a little foray into trying to understand tribal water quality standards. And first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Ibrahim Goodwin, and I'm an environmental scientist in the Office of Water at EPA headquarters in the Office of Science and Technology. And I work in the Standards and Health Protection Division. And what we do is we try to put guidance out that helps protect the water quality. And some of the things that we do is directly in response to requests that we get from different states and tribes to help them protect all uses, the highest uses. Next slide. So we're gonna go over a few topics really quickly. Barb gave us a good background on the Clean Water Act, but I'm gonna buttress that a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about water quality standards, the designated uses and the criteria used to protect those uses. And also we're gonna talk about tribal cultural uses. That's the main reason we're here, and give a few examples of tribal cultural uses. And also we'll do a little summary and observation on what I found on some of the research. And finally, I'm gonna do a shameless plug about a tool that you can use to help protect your watershed, to collect watershed data, as well as help protect it against fecal contamination, both for marine and for fresh waters. Next slide. So the background of the EPA and the Clean Water Act goes way back, you know, from the old Harbors Act and Rivers and Harbors Act way in the 1800s up until what we got now here. There you see one of the first Black mayors in a major metropolitan city called Stokes. When the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in 1969, you know, people didn't know what to do. There were many problems. So the Clean Water Act, as a result, was developed and passed by Congress. Believe it or not, it got vetoed by Richard Nixon, but Congress came together and overrode that presidential veto, and we got the Clean Water Act now, and it's had several iterations since then. Next slide. So our main goals with the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain that chemical, physical, and biological integrity. But we also have another little thing we put on the back so that we know that it provides for protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and out of water. So those are very important points, and all of those are going to tie into cultural uses in a second. Next slide. Some of the key sections of the Clean Water Act that you should be familiar with is the Clean Water Act, Section 305B, when states have to report on the conditions of their water every 2 years. And also, when they find that their water is polluted, they have to identify them on a 303D list. And there are other parts of the Clean Water Act that applies directly to citizen involvement that can help tribes and states get monies and grants to help them clean up their water and help report on those waters. And maybe we'll talk about that in another webinar. Next slide. Three main parts of the water quality standards that are their core components. We talk about designated uses, often referred to as the beneficial uses. And those are the goals. You know, if you get your goals right for the water, then the corresponding criteria that you use to protect those uses will fall right in line. And the third leg on that stool is anti-degradation requirement, so your water doesn't get worse than it was. Next slide. So, like I said, the uses are goals for a water body, and some of the uses that we have are protection for fishing, shellfish, recreation in and out of the water. We have agricultural uses, and of course, tribal and cultural uses. And the criteria that we use to protect those uses usually occur in different types. Sometimes we use aquatic life by looking at some of the microorganisms that might be in the water, biological criteria. We might use human health criteria when we're looking at things like E. coli. We have recreational activity when there's immersion in the water and other types of criteria, and so on and so on. Next. So this is an example of when we say primary contact. When you think that you're going to be in the water and you're going to immerse and probably swallow some water, primary contact. And that can be for primary contact recreation or primary contact for tribal cultural use. And secondary contact is when you're just in touch with the water, but maybe not going to immerse yourself fully and just touching the water, then that's, and you're not ingesting it, that's a secondary contact. Very important. Next slide. And of course, we want the fish to be good because we're eating them. So we actually have fish consumption for tribal uses. And we often find that in tribal communities, especially on the coast, they consume more fish. And that's a big concern, especially when there are a lot of toxics in the water. So we have fish consumption advisories throughout each state pretty much. And there's not a national standard. It depends on the waters that you get the fish from. Next slide. So what are tribal cultural uses? Well, we see in some tribal standards, they have a general statement. Most of them have a general statement that speaks to the future of the health on the reservation, as well as promoting a general health and welfare, and economic well-being, which is really important in the community, because that's one of the challenges that we see in many communities is economic. Some specific cultural water use issues are enumerated in some tribe standards. For example, the Lumi Nation says they're using it to fulfill their cultural, traditional, spiritual, and religious needs. That's straight out of their standards. The White Mountain Apache speaks to the word tu, which is water in their language. And that's explained as a gift of the creator that's protecting the survival of the people. And the people are responsible for protecting the streams and springs and meadows as a result of that heritage connection. Many of the pueblos in New Mexico speak to having religion and traditional purposes, whatever, like maybe sunrise, baptismal services, that they're using water where they might ingest or be immersed into the water. Next slide, please. So where are the tribes? Which standards? Well, we're looking at the map, and it basically tells us what is missing. There were tribes all over this country, and now we see the map of where they are now. So, you know, historical genocide basically pushed people west, and there are only 15 states in the whole United States that have tribes with approved water quality standards, even though many tribes still exist throughout the country. We need to do better to help them hopefully get approved water quality standards so that they can begin to control the political and the environmental affairs that goes on their lands. Next, please. Out of those 15 states, these are the ones that have water quality standards. You can see that New Mexico has the biggest number, as well as the state of Washington, and then California and Arizona. Many states only have one approved tribe, even though they have several tribes in their state. So again, that's a big opportunity for us to try to get more tribes with approved water quality standards. Next. One example of Arizona tribes is the White Mountain Apache tribe, and they're related to many different tribes within the Grand Canyon. And they actually have a very good system of standards and criteria. Next slide. And beginning with their definition of ceremonial use, as well as some of the other primary contact uses that they have in their standards. One deals with gathering of medicinal and culturally significant plants that they ingest. And this is very important. Now, particularly many people that are using these plants are sharing them with other cultures who finding that they have very good purposes for and cures, traditional cures. They also talk about their primary contact use in their standards for traditional and ceremonial purposes that include immersion and ingestion in water. And they have an appendix that actually denotes every water quality standard and criteria by water body, which is a good way to do it. Next slide, please. As part of their anti-DEG policy, they actually talk about the cultural or religious significant areas in it. And they also refer to archaeological or historical sites in their standards that could be used for cultural uses. Native riparian vegetation that might be gathered for medicinal uses, as well as they denote OTRWs, outstanding tribal resource waters, that are based on their cultural value or the historical site that it's in, or some of their eco-biological features, just that no degradation can be permitted in these waters. They're kept pristine for immersion and ingestion purposes. Next slide, please. They also talk about their narrative water quality standards, and specifically talk about their fecal coliform criteria, the pH, turbidity, algae, toxic and algae-free waters on the reservation. And they also define their cultural significance as having actions that disrespect the waters of the that have religious significance. Next slide. The next tribe that we're going to look at is the Florida tribes. And the Seminole tribe is one of the 3 federally recognized Seminole entities. And it's been around since 1957, and it has 6 reservations in Florida. Next slide, please. Their standards, they define ceremony and religious as particular use of that wadi body that's being used because of a unique, diverse plant and wildlife, or that it has some historic, cultural, or religious significance. They also classify their waters as ONRWs instead of ONTWs as the Apaches did, but this is basically the same thing. The primary intent is to keep the use from backsliding and degrading those waters. Some of the subclasses in the designated uses include protection of specific water bodies that are important for ceremonial and religious use. So as you can see, there's ways to put this language directly into your standards. And I encourage all tribal entities that aren't EPA approved. That doesn't mean you don't have to have your own water quality standards so that you can define the goals for the waters on your tribal lands. And section 12.3, they deal with water quality criteria. As Barb mentioned earlier, some water quality criteria is narrative. The Seminoles have quite a bit of narrative criteria, but they also have criteria, numeric criteria for all the waters, on all the surface waters on their reservation. Next slide, please. So in summary, we've found that 46 total tribes out of over 400, I guess 70 or something like that, maybe more, somebody correct me. But what we found that there was a very big diversity in how they describe their uses. And all but one of the approved tribes actually explicitly mention some sort of tribal or spiritual or religious or cultural use. Most of the tribes, again, are in the West and in the Midwest, with Washington and California, New Mexico, and Arizona as being those top states. 7 states have only 1 tribe with approved standards. So we got a lot of work to do here. Next slide, please. Some of the uses include plant gathering, unique aquatic ecology, aesthetic value, sweat baths, and of course having cultural, religious, and medicinal uses. And most tribes also have primary contact criteria, numeric criteria that are numeric, or most of them actually have numeric and narrative criteria. And finally, we kind of define ceremonial primary contact as the same pretty much as recreational primary contact, where we get intentional or incidental contact or in the water, and also ingestion and immersion, or when in sweat baths, maybe even vaporization. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the shameless plug that I talked about. EPA just put out a new version of our sanitary survey app. It's a great tool that we got that's on a GIS platform. I encourage you to put sanitary survey app, EPA sanitary survey app in your Google, or look at the link on the next slide. And, you know, just check us out. This is something that we're trying to help tribes develop user groups to collect data. And in order to use the survey, you have to have a QAP. And we just developed the model QAP. So that's online too, so that you can begin to, you know, up your learning curve with respect to how to collect data and put it in a format that you can share with other entities, whether adjoining states and cities or municipalities. When you are in control of the source data and you have a QAP to make your data scientifically defensible, you're in a better space, and you can better help people to understand what's going on in your watershed. Next slide, please. And this is just a description, again, of the sanitary survey app. This is the link down below. If you go to our beach page, it has it. Again, this app is used not only for marine data collection, but also fresh waters. So we've actually did a workshop in California with a tribe there and some local watershed groups to teach how to use this app. And I think we're going to be getting something together soon in California. So stay tuned. And anyone else who's interested in these surveys and learning how to develop a QAP, reach out to us and let us know. Next slide. And that's it. For more information, I'm at your service.
Thanks, Ibrahim. That was a lot of good information. Again, it's our intention to perhaps dive a little deeper into some of these tribal examples and have richer discussions and questions and obstacles, and having representatives from each of these tribes, if possible, even speak on their own behalf. There's some questions that are in the chat we'll try to answer. And again, keep putting them in there. If we don't get to them verbally or in the chat, we'll get to them at the end here. With that, Nick, would you mind carrying on and telling a perspective from California? And thanks again, Ibrahim. That was great.
Sure, yeah, thanks again. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Martorano. I work for the California State Water Resources Control Board in the Office of Information Management and Analysis. I am in Sacramento, California, which includes the traditional and ancestral and unceded land of the Miwok, Patwin, and Nisenan nations. Happy to be here today. My intent for this, my kind of short portion, is just to kind of give a little bit background on what California has done related to tribal beneficial uses, and kind of the process and some of the kind of maybe more onerous parts of getting a tribal beneficial use created, and then taking it to the next level with actually getting a water quality standard to protect those uses into place, and some of the products that have been recently developed. I'm not the tribal coordinator for the state. Adriana Renteria is, and I'll reference some more expertise on these topics for more specific answers to any questions that come up, but I'll do my best to answer questions at the end as well. And sorry if I'm looking away. I've the slides on one screen and the camera's on a different screen. So first off, kind of the main thing that California did was we started in 2017 by establishing these 3 tribal beneficial uses, which were statewide and part of standards action for mercury. So it was pretty groundbreaking. We were not only establishing mercury objectives, but we used that opportunity to establish California's first tribal beneficial uses that applied on the statewide level. There are some regional water boards, and California is a little unique in that we have a very long state, and we've broken up our state into 9 regional boards because we have different ecological areas, different basins, and they each have their own set of beneficial uses and designations and standards that apply regionally. But this was the first one that applied statewide, and they included tribal, traditional, and cultural uses, tribal subsistence fishing, and subsistence fishing. And while subsistence fishing isn't specific to the tribal uses, we include it here just for ease of reference, because they were all done at the same time. And there are other communities that are consuming fish at a higher rate than what our advisories are based on. This happened back in 2017. At the time, it was a really big deal and took years to get to that point of establishing these statewide tribal beneficial uses. Along with the uses, they also created one of the first statewide tribal water quality objectives, or the first tribal statewide water quality objective, which was for concentrations of methylmercury in fish, specifically for tribal subsistence uses, recognizing that our current objectives and our advisories for fish consumption are based on kind of a standardized consumption rate that doesn't take into account many communities, specifically tribes that are consuming fish at a much higher rate, which Ibrahim mentioned. So this was the first objective that relates directly to one of the uses that was created as part of this action. So that was the first step, getting the uses in place. And that again took the better part of a decade to get from start to finish, but was still pretty groundbreaking to get done. That's just the first step. It's been about 5 years since that happened, and we just finally came out with this document that I encourage you all to check out, and I can maybe show it later. It's hard for me to do that at the same time right now, but we kind of laid out a path forward from getting from point A to point B. Once you have an objective put into your basin plan, how do you then get it designated to your water body? Then you establish a water quality objective, and then you put in an implementation program, and then it's enforcement. This document that was put together by our Tribal Affairs Office is fantastic in my opinion, and it really helps answers a lot of questions that tribes had after that 2017 action. There was kind of a miscommunication or where tribes thought with those tribal beneficial uses being made available that they all of a sudden applied to their waters and their tribal lands, or waters that flow into their tribal lands, and that was not the case. There's many steps that have to go into place following the actual use being there, that you have to designate to a water body, which is a process in itself. And then again, establishing water quality objectives takes that science piece that Ibrahim talked about at the end of his presentation. So there's a lot of work that's involved, and this document does a great job of laying that all out, and also providing information to California tribes on how and how best to get involved with their regional boards and state boards to move the process forward. So like I said, it's not really an easy process, and requires a significant amount of time and work by the tribes, which I know it can be a big ask to already resource limited communities. Some of our regional boards have taken initial steps by adding the beneficial uses of their basin plans, which is a good first step. And a lot of times you can do the addition of basin, the use to basin plan and the designation at the same time. So there are areas where they can be streamlined. To this point, I'm not aware of any specific water bodies that have been designated with the new tribal beneficial uses. There are tribal uses that were defined in our North Coast region prior to 2017, and there are designations there. So there is a potential opportunity in those cases. But again, I'm not the expert for our North Coast region. There is potential there. And so how do you get from, like I said, from the tribal use to actually having an enforceable standard in place? It's a lot of tribes have a long way to go. It takes a lot of engagement from both the regional boards end as well as the tribes to request those engagement opportunities. We need to provide evidence that the uses exist in specific water bodies. That can be problematic because there's data sovereignty issues, tribal data sovereignty issues that we want to be sensitive to. There are specific areas that have great sacred significance, and even members of certain tribes aren't aware of them, let alone share them with a state government that has done many wrongs to the tribes in the past. There is a need also for the regional boards to prioritize tribal beneficiaries during their triennial review. So every 3 years, a regional board looks at their basin plan and prioritizes the action for the following 3 years. And that's a process that's outlined in that document I mentioned, that it's an opportunity for the tribes to request, hey, prioritize this through your triennial review process, is adding and designating uses in the basin plan. That's a really brief overview of what's going on in California. I again encourage you to go to our tribal affairs webpage. The email that's best used to ask specific tribal related questions is the tribal liaison that gets directly to Adriana Renteria and her staff. I'm more than happy to help answer questions as well. And again, I encourage you to look at that document, and potentially if there's time at the end, we can go over it in kind of greater detail. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for providing an example of what a state is trying to do. Keep track of your questions, and folks, if you could put your questions in the Q&A button instead of the chat, that would be helpful for us to track them. But we're going to get to questions here after 2 more little topics. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about designated uses and criteria and systems set up to protect those uses. And I call that being on the front end of the Clean Water Act. As Ibrahim said, if it's set up, your goal is set up, and your standards are the best they can be, and your monitoring program is effective, and then your follow-up from results of that monitoring, that the front end part of all of that is assigning those designated uses, your goals, and getting the standards right, and then the processes in place there. Part of that workflow, of course, is the data that gets generated and where it's put and where it's used. And the EPA also provides, along with other assistance and sections in the acts, often provides support in that data management and that data sharing. One way they provide that support is supporting the National Water Quality Portal, where often data is put. It can bring up a lot of issues and sensitivity to how that data is shared and used, and who gets to use it and what goes along with it. And then, of course, that opens the door to potential misuse. And that's especially a problem for some types of information for sovereign nations. So under the auspices of sort of bringing up a lot of topics to sort of wet our whistle, I'm going to raise or bring to your attention or your knowledge or awareness one possible solution or opportunity to help appropriately use traditional knowledge, what I'm calling more at the back end, at the data use and the data sharing part of the workflow. Next slide, please. So these systems that we have that gather the data and manage it and validate it and share it, technology has made it really, really easier to share all kinds of information. But that doesn't mean that the sharing that's going on is ethical or respective or inclusive or any of those kind of things that are important to people, these things that are important. Some of you might be familiar with FAIR data principles that have helped and supported the sharing of data. And FAIR is an acronym for creating a data set. I like to think of it as you're creating an asset. If you can meet FAIR data principles, your data will be used more than for its original purpose and can be used more than once. So it has a life much longer than its original intent. And if it's done adequately, people getting that data can decide if it's appropriate to use for their purpose or for to use again. That's all under this idea of FAIR data principles, that you make your data findable, you make it accessible, you make it interoperable, and you allow it to be reused. There's a lot of detail in FAIR data principles, but this is what's basically helped guide technology to allow data sharing to happen. And data sharing in itself is not a wrong or bad thing. In fact, it's an important thing so that we don't keep spinning our wheels and we use the data that we have out there more effectively. So the goal behind FAIR data principles is to facilitate effective data sharing and effective data use. However, this sort of technologically driven system does not handle and accommodate traditional environmental or ecological knowledge very well. Next slide, please. There is a movement that's out there that many people are not aware of, and that is including and integrating CARE principles for Indigenous data and governance. So CARE principles, again, this is around Indigenous data and governance of all the different kinds of data that might exist out there, whether it's an actual chemical result or anything else. And CARE principles, there's a lot to them, and I don't want to shortchange it. We could have a whole webinar just on this. I just want to introduce you to this, where C stands for who's benefiting, what's the collective benefit for basically sharing and looking at who benefits from sharing this data, and is it equal, is it equitable? You know, that kind of question that sometimes we can get into sharing data, if you will, for purposes that actually cause harm, or if they're for one benefit and not for all, if you will, or not considering who's benefiting. A stands for authority to control, and this is for tribal sovereignty, is the ability for them to control their own information, just like any state would want to, any agency would want to. It would be a normal thing to want to be able to have the authority to control how your information is used and where, etc. R stands for responsibility in that use. And then E is the ethical considerations, of which, you know, let's face it, a lot of us are very ignorant unless we actually listen to and go to the tribal entities themselves to understand what is important. We can't assume that we know what is ethical, if you will, in our systems, in these data ecosystems. So the goal with CARE principles for Indigenous data governance is to navigate this tension between the secondary use of protecting the indigenous rights and the interests of Indigenous data that includes traditional knowledge, while still at the same time supporting the ability to have open data sharing and machine learning and things that live over there in the FAIR data standards world. Next slide, please. What CARE principles do is help promote equitable participation in the process of data reuse, which will result in more equitable outcomes. That's the intent and the impact that is desired. What CARE principles do is bring the people and the purpose of the data into the conversation. So it's people and purpose centered, which is often left out of our technology workflows. And specifically, it's designed to advance the innovation and the governance and the self-determination of Native people, to help integrate. And so this is dealing with this problem, if you will, or this issue at the back end where data is being managed and already shared. But I like to argue that it would be even more effective if we would center the needs of these nations in our monitoring designs, in our upfront, in our study designs, in the policy up front. If Native Americans' needs were centered up there, this probably wouldn't be an issue down in the workflow. So it's something for all of us to think about, where and when we're actually including and in listening to Native people's issues and needs. You can find out more about this. You guys will get a copy of this in the recording. The slideshow will be there. And behind this link is the Data Science Journal, where the basis for CARE data principles are shared and elaborated on with illustrations and more content. These were developed by the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Group in alliance with the Research Data Alliance, which is a network of nation-based indigenous sovereign nations. It was developed by the people who it should have been developed by, so we should pay attention and begin to integrate these. This is not easy. It's fairly new. There is some literature and documentation out there of folks beginning to integrate these. So this is some new ground we can all explore on and work on together, primarily taking the lead from Native nations and sovereign nations and listening to them and integrating their suggestions with the power and authority that we do have. Next slide. So our last topic today, and then we can go to questions, is I'm going to give it up to you, Sylvia, to talk about the new launch with the How's My Waterway application.
Yeah, thanks, Barb. Just wanted to quickly provide this new update to the How's My Waterway website. It's a website on informing the conversation about your water. So you can look up information about waterways in your community. And you see there in the middle tab, it used to just say state, but now it says state and tribal. And the link I'll put in the chat right now. Next slide, please. So there are right now 14 pages, tribal pages, based on input provided by the tribes directly on the type of information and even the design of these pages as well. And you can see a map there and some information about the waterways being monitored and assessed. The map, based on tribal input, it shows both the waters that are assessed by the tribe as well as outside the non-tribal monitored waters in the state as well. Next slide. And then important connection to the topic today, you'll be able to find more information about each of these water bodies through a water body report. And you can see that this example here from Minnesota Chippewa tribe, the tribe has specific designated uses like the cultural one there circled in blue, wild rice areas. And it shows the condition information for each water body and for each use. So that's available now. I think it was just released right before this webinar or during it. So brand new pages, and hope that as more tribes develop water quality standards, there'll be additional pages added to this website as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Nick and Ibrahim, if you want to turn on your cameras, I'm going to try to track some questions here for the appropriate panelists. I think this one might be for you, Ibrahim. What does it mean for there to be a statewide tribal beneficial use?
I think that was for me, but
oh, sorry. Okay, Nick.
There's a difference in California, is a little bit unique, and I don't know if this applies nationally or other states, but because the state is broken up into 9 semi-autonomous regional water boards that each have a basin plan where they have their own defined beneficial uses and their own region-specific water quality objectives and their designations to the waters within their region. there's a lot of variation, like maybe even just small ones between beneficial use definitions. The State Water Board, which is the overarching kind of umbrella organization over those regions, has the ability to set statewide beneficial uses that apply across regional boards and create consistency, and also is a little bit easier for regional board to take a statewide objective and put it into their basin plan without taking some additional steps. So the state board defines at times statewide beneficial uses to allow for a consistency of application of standards, because we at the same time we did adopt a standard for subsistence mercury fish consumption of mercury. So that's applied consistently statewide, but also allows for the regional boards to add those to their basin plans more easily.
Let's see. Folks, notice in the chat, folks are putting in awesome resources and offering more information. One of the questions that was asked in the chat, sorry, not in the chat, but in the QA box, was a high-level question about dealing with water quantity issues and water quality and the nexus of that, and can water quality issues or enforcement help the challenges with water quantity? And in general, the answer to that is no. You can see the response in the QA. And that is primarily because water rights legislations have been around for 100 years, and the Clean Water Act is only 50 years old. And in most states, quantity and quality is managed in completely different organizations, completely different set of regulations and policies. And almost all Clean Water Acts at the state level supersede water right legislation supersedes any water quality legislation. What does that really mean? That means that there could not be a water quality regulation that would not allow someone to exercise their water right. So basically, water rights trump. That said, I'm sure there are exceptions, and that also said climate change is forcing that nexus to come together and function differently, and we'll see how that goes in the future. Let's see. There was also a question: are tribal uses for water quality standards impacted by? Oh, that was that one. Let's see.
I think I want to check in, Barb, real quick
time?
on. No, that's fine. If people want to ask questions verbally, you can raise your hand. There's a person that's had their hand up since fairly early. I want to go ahead and let Aaliyah go ahead and allow you to talk.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
I can't see everybody. Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else that wants to ask a question verbally,
please do.
Just raise your hand and I'll give you access. You have to unmute yourself though. And maybe.
Sorry about that. Took me a minute. So I know a specific example was given for California on working with particular tribes and trying to accommodate certain like sovereign rights and things like that. But by any chance, are there specific examples also in like Colorado or any of the other states mentioned?
Well, I could say that I know that with respect to our sanitary survey app, we are supporting tribes as well as citizen science and environmental justice organizations that are engaging with water monitoring and water management programs all over the country and throughout every state. So, I mean, the opportunity is there. We're just really getting to the point where we're doing more outreach. We can do better. But if you are interested, I encourage you to put in the chat or reach out to one of us to see if we can, help you be, better engaged, because we can do better with outreach.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't brought up, but through the EPA, states and tribes and territories get funding to adopt and implement their own Clean Water Acts. And they also can delegate parts of the act to the EPA to supersede in their state. Most states do not, through their own tax dollar, their own systems, do not add to that funding. So that almost all states and tribes are implementing their Clean Water Act basically based on what the federal government provides them, which is not enough. It's absolutely not enough to do all the elements of the Clean Water Act. So a lot of people want to know why there isn't more done. And it's interesting, there's this discrepancy between what we want to see to protect our waters and our aversion to funding government oversight in those regulations to help protect it. And that is even exacerbated for tribal entities through the historic genocide and oppression. They have not been able to reap the benefits of the economic growth and building that part of their economy and nation up to apply. There's a lot of needs that are underserved, and the environment is just one. Let's see.
Yeah, it's a question for you, Barb, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe Ibrahim as well.
So maybe I'll read the question. Clarifying at the beginning, I mentioned that there's a limited ability to integrate local, anecdotal, observational, and traditional ecological knowledge into the Clean Water Act. But Ibrahim mentioned that the tribes approved some standards and that did integrate, all but one did integrate tribal, cultural, traditional, spiritual, ceremony uses, trying to reconcile these two statements. I think my statement was more about it's difficult. It's not, the system is set up to handle numbers and quotas, and it's a challenge to get observational, traditional, anecdotal knowledge to be integrated into the actual decision-making process that is so reliant upon hard numbers and hard thresholds and predictability, and objective, not subjective. Doesn't mean it's not possible. So I think maybe one way to reconcile that is to realize there's these sort of formal workflows and processes that don't necessarily integrate informal and other types of information. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, it can't happen, but it's really like you have to advocate and figure out how it's to be used. And I think states are more open and have different capacities to do that. I don't know if that answers your question. And Ibrahim, maybe you want to take a shot at that question as well.
Well, we finding that when you introduce sound, up-to-date scientific methods to a lot of the tribal programs, that they the numbers begin to grow in terms of using this science to help protect their water management plans. And as it gets more and more challenging, especially with freshwater sources, it's more and more important for the states as well as the tribes to share water quality data and pollutant source data and land use data, so that there's an overall commitment to share information and data and build a collaboration. I think and a lot of times the federal government can be kind of that glue, the catalyst to make that happen. So hopefully we're here again, like I said, trying to give you some methods to collect sound data and guidance to do it as well.
Really good question. Thanks, Ibrahim. Another question is, what if tribal use of water negatively affects or impacts water quality in other regions? Does the federal or tribal government have power in this situation? I'll give a shot at that answer because the two tribes in Colorado are down in the southwest corner. One of them, their entire land base is intact. It's a whole complete unit. Think of it like it's a whole intact state. The other tribe has what we call checkerboarded land. And this is the case in a lot of tribes where at some point they sold off parts of their reservation to other people, to the white system, if you will, and that created this checkerboard of ownership across the land. And if you think about a checkerboard, if you were to imagine a checkerboard and watch a river winding through that checkerboard, where there's one set of Clean Water Act standards on the red squares and another set on the black squares, it becomes a very challenging thing to implement and adopt. What's good to know is that the Clean Water Act at the federal level, when a tribe, a state, or a territory takes money to adopt their own act, that act and all its components has to be as protective as the federal act or more. So that when a tribe does adopt their own standards and they're using that system as a sovereign nation, typically they're building off of what is around them. So in those checkerboarded situations, the enforcement and the standards usually align, and that makes sense for everybody because you can't avoid that upstream. The Clean Water Act doesn't allow someone to come down in the middle and have a whole completely different set of standards that would negate what's upstream of it. So in some ways, yes, the system is set up to protect from that, but it absolutely makes the implementation and the adoption of standards more challenging. Vice versa, it's actually probably more egregious where the standards in the white lands, if you will, are probably causing more harm to cultural and traditional uses for the Native Americans than the other way around. And that's really where the imbalance occurs more frequently in my experience. Again, Nancy, thanks. There's some good resources and comments in the chat around that question. Any more questions or thinking? If you've got some ideas on anything we presented today that you'd like to hear more about, drop it in the chat so we kind of can prioritize what perhaps the next webinar might be. I don't want to take too much of your time, but we could take a few more questions if folks want to hang around for a minute, either verbally or written. Everybody's maybe still from a snowstorm or still it's Monday, they're not awake, and I know a lot of information was presented. We do want to thank everybody who came, and your wisdom and your knowledge is very welcome and supported. Again, it'd be great to see what you'd like to see the next topic on this be and keep the conversation rolling. I'd like to thank both Nick and Ibrahim for putting together their presentation and Sylvia sliding in that new resource. And we look forward to, you'll get an email about the recording and the slides to follow up on this. And we look forward to having some future conversations and brainstorming sessions on how to continue to improve this area of our Clean Water Act. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You.